I am Jess Templeton and I work at GGLO Design, and we're going to go through our LCA process where we are now. I guess it's just slow. All right, so over this past year, we've really stepped up our efforts in strategizing towards being climate positive by 2030. So essentially, we are looking at running tally to EC3 analyses on all of our projects, and then also using the Cove tool for operational carbon, and using tally at basically every stage of the design process to see where we are, and then eventually to move those into EC3 to procure products and actually get to climate positive buildings. So when we first approached this, we really didn't find a great multifamily baseline or benchmark. The Carbon Leadership Forum said under 500 kilograms CO2 per meter squared, and we wanted something just more realistic and accurate so that we could really understand how we were reducing our carbon moving forward. So our main strategy was this past summer, we did tally analyses on 15 different buildings and 5 building types within that. And when I say building types, so GGLO does we work in a few different sectors, but we really mostly work in multifamily housing. So we focused on that sector. And then we broke it down into the different sort of building sizes. So you can see here, 4-story slab on grade, wrap building, which those are the buildings that are, there's the parking garage in the center, and then units wrapping around. Mid-rise type 5/1, mid-rise type 3/1, high-rise, and then we did look at an LVC building as well. And we wanted to get at least 2 buildings within each of these groups so that we could understand for each of those typologies kind of what our benchmark was. And the 2 buildings in red, those were buildings that were in much earlier phases of design, so concept or SD, and they didn't necessarily have everything modeled. So when we do our tally analysis, we're using all categories. We're looking at not just core and shell, but everything that tally will tally. And so those 2 didn't have things like drop soffits or finished floors necessarily added, and they also still had quite a few generic materials, which are somewhat of a nightmare in tally. And the other caveat is that we have been transitioning over to the use of parallax doors, and right now tally does not read those at all. So we're working with Roderick at Kieran Timberlake to figure out how we can get tally to read those doors. I also wanted to point out our LVC pedal project is showing as quite high. And one of the lessons learned was that there's an efficiency, obviously, for a building size and kind of the ratio of the high embodied carbon materials, such as concrete, to other materials. And this LVC project has 3 levels of concrete, 2 levels of wood, and then a wood roof. And there's a huge commercial component and only 65 wood units above. And so that ratio of concrete was much higher. In addition, we were looking toward occupant health and things like natural ventilation and light from multiple sides. And so we did an open courtyard with exterior circulation, which is great from the occupant standpoint. And, energy savings as far as not conditioning a corridor. But on the other hand, that means additional enclosure. And also those corridors ended up being finished with a concrete paver product. So again, just a higher embodied energy. We weren't looking at carbon when we designed that building, but it's just a great lesson learned for moving forward and being mindful of that. I just wanted to give you an idea. This is where we ended up for all of our projects across the 15. It's no surprise that concrete accounts for 52% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and finishes are at 17. But one reason that we broke it down into typologies was so that intuitively, I think as designers, we all know that, depending on if it's a 4-story slab on grade building or a mid-rise building, there will be different hotspots. But I think this just allows us to give our designers a visual that if you're designing a specific type of building, just what you should really focus on as far as carbon reduction is concerned. So you see here on the left, a 4-story slab on grade, obviously the finishes will be much greater than the concrete versus like a mid-rise where the concrete is 57%. So how have we dealt with consistency in our process? We've done 2 things. So I've been the main person doing the analyses, but right from the start, I did create a user, basically a user document that guides us all on the resources that are available, and then also what our firm standards are and practices. And so as different people came into it, we were able to give them that document and run them through kind of our process, and so that we would be as close as we could be to being consistent. Along with that, we took every tally material and created this amazing spreadsheet. So interesting. But what we did, we wanted to look at, for our project benchmarks, we kind of wanted to look at all of our projects across the board. And in multifamily housing, there are quite a few specifications that are exactly the same across the board. And so we took our most typical specifications for all of our projects and applied those to every one of those 15 projects that you just saw. The idea being that we didn't have time or, funds in order to look at all 100 projects or whatever are going on right now to see what our benchmark is in that way. And so this was a way that we were trying to approach it methodically, to think about, we chose our most sort of typical projects in each of those typologies, and then we're choosing our most typical specifications to give us the best idea of where we currently stand as a firm, and then to help us understand, what percentage reduction we're getting. And moving forward will be a lot more project specific, but this was a way that we felt like gave us an even playing field where we could compare apples to apples and, understand more generally how our whole firm was performing. So these were vetted by members of our firm, and then we also reached out to CPL. I don't know if Laura is on the call, but thank you, Laura, for your help just in making sure that our assumptions were correct for concrete and all of the other structural systems. Within that, we did things like in our buildings, we often end up with stud packs around hold downs that are 12, 14, 16 studs deep. And so the 16 inches on center is not really an accurate representation of the wood use. And so we actually reduced that spacing to 12 inches on center. So there were things like that that we added to the spreadsheet, and then all of our projects have employed to try to get us closer to being accurate. And the number of folks, so we have had up to 5 people doing analyses. And then moving into 2021, there are 3 of us that are really focused on the embodied carbon aspect. But because every project is going to undergo tally analysis, I have a feeling that there will be a lot of training, and more people are going to end up using this as well. So another thing that we're doing moving forward to try to expedite and be efficient in this process is, and also different tally definitions, is we use Unify for all of our assemblies, families, etc., and getting as much tally information into Unify as we can, so that when teams pull any wall assemblies or families from Unify, it already has that tally information, so that then when we go to that project team and we run tally analyses, it will be part of the way there. Like, there will always be more materials we'll need to add, but at least we'll be part of the way there. Same thing with our Revit template, just getting as much tally definition information in there as we can moving forward. So as I mentioned, I think this will take a lot of education for our firm and best modeling practices, especially as far as materials are concerned, and just trying to minimize the number of different components in a project, so that we can try to be efficient, which is just kind of good practice in itself. Another thing that we're doing moving forward is really looking at our specifications. And we've been doing a lot of these, as well as the 15 projects that we've looked at. We've done a lot of these side-by-side comparisons, which I'm sure many of you have done as well, looking at specific components or materials. to understand, you know, where we can find the most savings, and also to use as tools to help educate our clients and teams as well. And we're running many of these as far as, you know, moving into 2018 energy code. We're looking at the different wall assembly options that we have to meet the new energy code and how those compare from a carbon standpoint. Alongside with this, we've also been really leaning on building green resource guides and carbon smart material palettes ideas as well, just to make sure, obviously, we're focused on carbon, but we don't want to forget about everything else as well, as far as the products that we actually specify. So the next steps, as I mentioned, we are going to dive deep into eventually we'll dive deep into 20 projects, but we're going to dive deep into 2 projects, really pushing how far we can reduce the carbon to understand kind of the cost benefit analysis of all the choices, and looking at both the sort of major component switch out opportunities for reduction, and then also more specifically the products and how those can affect. So things like concrete specifications, and looking at that all towards getting climate positive buildings by 2030. So that is where we are for our process right now. Does anyone have questions? And I did not look at any of the chat during that, so I can also go back for that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is Patrick.
Yeah.
So I'm from Integris, and we're looking at a similar study on some of our K-12 projects. We haven't gotten very far with it yet, but one of our decision-making points is whether we would use Tally or Athena. I'm wondering, did you look at Athena? Has anyone here on the call experience with Athena and comparing it to Tally in you know, the different kinds of outputs and usefulness of those different tools in comparison? Thanks.
Yeah, I myself did not look at Athena. Other members of our firm did a few years ago and decided that Tally was more aligned with what we wanted. Any other folks familiar with Athena?
We went through sort of the same exercise at Methuen. I think also just from a ease of use and kind of integrating that into the project workflow, Tally's been really useful as an add-in in Revit where teams are already working.
I do see a question from Chris about our in-house landscape department. And he asked, have you begun to look at embodied carbon opportunities, impacts of your site and planting designs? Yes, we have. So we are using the climate positive tool, which I should have mentioned. Our landscape teams are looking at that, which basically it allows you to look at your impacts of your hardscape materials, and then the offset that you can achieve with any of your planting as well. So the carbon sequestration and analyzing that. So I think we've only analyzed one project, and that would be interesting to check in later in the year or later in 2021 to see where that heads for us.
Yeah. And Jessie, this is David. I work with Jessie at GGLO on this effort. We also have reached out to the DDX team because we tried to see if we could auto-report EC information into DDX, and you can't on a landscape project, and you currently can't do it. They ask you for your building information, and then if you have embodied carbon, you can also enter that. So they're trying to work on a way to directly enter just landscape only projects. So when teams are geared up and ready to report landscape only, they'll have a way to do it. Just wanted the group to know about that effort.
When I see from Jay Walls, there's a story about, or a question about anyone digging further into the climate positive Pathfinder to understand how accurate it is. We are planning on doing a comparison, so between Tally and Pathfinder, to see specifically the hardscape, how those two compare